I wasn't planning to attend the funeral. My father, Patrick Sullivan, had been a ghost in my life for as long as I could remember. He walked out on my mom and me when I was 7, leaving behind nothing but an old photo album and a few hazy memories. Mom did her best to shield me from the pain, telling me stories about how he was a complicated man and how some people just weren't cut out for family life. But as I grew older, I realized those were just excuses for his selfishness. When I got the call from a lawyer saying Patrick had passed away and I was named in his will, my first instinct was to hang up. I hadn't heard from him in over 20 years. What could he possibly have left me? But something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the faint hope that this was some kind of belated apology. So, against my better judgment, I showed up at the funeral. It was a small, quiet affair, held in a nondescript funeral home on the outskirts of Chicago. Only a handful of people were there, strangers mostly, along with a woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Karen, my father's second wife. She looked surprised to see me. "You must be James," she said, offering a tentative smile. I nodded, unsure of what to say. "I'm sorry for your loss," she added, though her tone lacked conviction. "Thanks," I replied, glancing around the room. The atmosphere was awkward, tense. It was clear that Patrick hadn't been much of a family man in his second life, either. After the service, the lawyer approached me. He was a short, wiry man with sharp features and an air of efficiency. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, extending a hand. "I am David Klein. I handled your father's estate." "Estate?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. He nodded. "Your father didn't leave much behind, but he did specify that you were to inherit a safe located in his storage unit. He left a key and instructions for you to retrieve it." I stared at him, caught off guard. "A safe?" "Yes," Klein said, handing me a small brass key attached to a worn leather tag. "The storage unit is paid for through the end of the year. After that, it's up to you." A part of me wanted to walk away, to leave the safe and whatever secrets it held in the past where they belonged. But another part of me, a curious, restless part, couldn't resist the pull. The next day, I drove out to the storage facility. It was an old, run-down place on the edge of town, the kind of place where people stash forgotten furniture and boxes of memories they couldn't bear to throw away. The manager, a gruff man with a thick Chicago accent, led me to Unit 317. "Your old man rented this unit for almost 15 years, he said, unlocking the door. "Never missed a payment, but he didn't come by much either." The door creaked open, revealing a dim, dusty space filled with neatly stacked boxes. In the center of the room sat a heavy, steel safe, its surface scratched and worn from years of use. I approached it slowly, the key trembling in my hand. What could possibly be inside? Documents? Money? Something darker? The lock clicked open with a soft metallic snap, and I pulled the heavy door wide. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The safe was packed with folders, envelopes, and what appeared to be old legal documents. On top of the pile was a yellowed envelope with my name scrawled across the front in Patrick's messy handwriting. I hesitated, my pulse quickening, before tearing it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "James, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need your help. What's in this safe is bigger than both of us. Be careful who you trust." "Dad." My hands shook as I reread the note. What was he talking about? What could possibly be in this safe that required a warning like that? I spent the next 2 hours sifting through the contents of the safe. The documents inside were a confusing mix of bank statements, property deeds, and legal agreements. Many of them were decades old, and some were tied to names I didn't recognize. But the further I dug, the stranger it got. One folder labeled Blackhawk Industries caught my attention. Inside were contracts and memos referencing offshore accounts, undisclosed assets, and something called Project Nightfall. None of it made sense to me, but it all felt wrong. At the bottom of the safe, I found a small black notebook. The pages were filled with Patrick's handwriting, names, dates, and cryptic notes that seemed to reference meetings and transactions. One name appeared over and over again: Michael Drake. Who was Michael Drake? And why did Patrick seem so obsessed with him? By the time I left the storage unit, my mind was racing. My father, The man I'd written off as a deadbeat had clearly been involved in something far more complicated and dangerous than I'd ever imagined. But what was it, and why had he left it to me? I didn't have answers yet, but one thing was clear. Whatever my father had been involved in, it wasn't over. And now I was part of it. I couldn't shake the feeling that opening the safe had set something into motion. Patrick's warning, "Be careful who you trust," kept looping in my mind, but I didn't know who I was supposed to be wary of. After leaving the storage unit, I spread the documents out on my dining room table, trying to make sense of them. The folder labeled Blackhawk Industries was especially troubling. I'd never heard of the company, but the contracts and memos inside hinted at something shady. Offshore accounts, undisclosed assets, and vague references to compliance measures all painted a picture of a business that thrived in secrecy. Then there was the name that appeared repeatedly in Patrick's notebook, Michael Drake. Who was he? Over the next few days, I became consumed by the mystery. I spent hours researching Blackhawk Industries and Michael Drake, but I kept hitting dead ends. Blackhawk's website was a single, barren page with a generic mission statement and no contact information. There were no press releases, no employee profiles, nothing that would tell me what the company actually did. As for Michael Drake, the name was too common to pin down. A dozen LinkedIn profiles popped up, but none of them seemed connected to Blackhawk or anything suspicious. I was frustrated, but determined. My father had left me this puzzle for a reason, and I wasn't going to walk away from it. One night, as I was going through the documents for the 100th time, I found something I'd missed before. Tucked inside the Blackhawk Industries folder was a torn business card with the name Drake scrawled on the back in Patrick's handwriting. The front of the card was for a bar called the Red Lantern, located in the old industrial district on the south side of Chicago. It wasn't much of a lead, but it was the only tangible clue I had. The next evening, I decided to check it out. The Red Lantern was exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find in an industrial district, dimly lit with peeling paint and a faint smell of stale beer. The neon sign outside flickered erratically, casting the entrance in an eerie red glow. Inside, the bar was nearly empty. A bored-looking bartender was wiping down the counter, and a couple of patrons sat hunched over their drinks. I felt out of place in my button-down shirt and jeans, but I forced myself to walk up to the bar. "What can I get you?" the bartender asked, barely glancing at me. I hesitated, unsure how to bring up the card. Just a beer," I said finally. As he poured the drink, I pulled out the card and set it on the counter. "You ever seen this before?" I asked. The bartender's eyes flicked to the card, and for a brief moment, his expression shifted, surprise, maybe even recognition. But it was gone in an instant. "Can't say I have," he said, sliding the beer toward me. I frowned, studying his face. He was lying, I was sure of it. I decided to wait. I nursed my beer for nearly an hour, watching the comings and goings of the bar. A few more patrons trickled in, most of them keeping to themselves. But just as I was about to give up, a man walked in who caught my attention. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and a purposeful stride. He glanced around the room, his eyes briefly landing on me before moving on. The bartender straightened as the man approached, his demeanor shifting from bored to attentive. They exchanged a few quiet words, too low for me to hear, and then the man turned and headed toward a door marked private at the back of the bar. My heart raced. Could this man be connected to Michael Drake? I waited until the bartender's attention was elsewhere before slipping off my stool and making my way toward the door. It was slightly ajar, revealing a dimly lit hallway beyond. I hesitated for a moment, my father's warning echoing in my mind. Be careful who you trust. But this wasn't about trust, it was about answers. I slipped through the door, my footsteps soft on the worn linoleum floor. The hallway was lined with closed doors, but I could hear muffled voices coming from one of them. I crept closer, pressing myself against the wall as I strained to listen. Not what we agreed, one voice said, low and gravelly. Things have changed, another voice replied, sharper and more authoritative. The Sullivan situation needs to be handled. We can't afford any loose ends. My breath caught. They were talking about Patrick. I stayed frozen in place, my heart pounding as the conversation continued. We'll take care of it, the first voice said. But what about the kid? The kid. Were they talking about me? Keep an eye on him, the second voice said. If he starts digging, we'll deal with him too. A cold wave of fear washed over me. These people weren't just shady, they were dangerous. And they knew about me. I barely made it out of the bar without being seen. My hands were shaking as I drove home, my mind racing. Patrick had been involved in something far darker than I'd imagined. Blackhawk Industries wasn't just a shady company. It was part of a criminal operation. And now, because of the safe, I was on their radar. That night, I locked every door and window in my apartment, double-checking them before I went to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak and shadow felt like a threat, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. In the morning, I found an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message typed in bold letters. Stay out of it. The warning note didn't leave my hands for nearly 10 minutes as I stared at it, my mind spinning. The message was short, but the threat was clear. Someone was watching me, and they wanted me to stop digging into whatever Patrick had left behind. I should have felt scared. I did feel scared, but more than that, I felt angry. Angry that my father's secrets were dragging me into something dangerous. Angry that these people thought they could intimidate me into silence. Most of all, I felt determined. Whoever sent this note underestimated me. I wasn't going to back down. I started by reviewing everything I'd uncovered so far. The documents from the safe, Patrick's cryptic notebook, the overheard conversation at the Red Lantern. It was all connected to Blackhawk Industries and, by extension, Michael Drake. But I still didn't know who Drake was or why he seemed so central to everything. I needed help. The only person I could think to call was Kevin, my old college roommate, and the same lawyer who'd helped me make sense of the safe's financial documents. Kevin wasn't thrilled to hear from me again. "James, I told you to tread carefully," he said when I explained the situation. "These people aren't just running a shady business. They're criminals. Organized, powerful criminals." "I know that now," I said. "But I can't just walk away. They're watching me, Kevin. They sent me a warning." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What do you want me to do?" Kevin asked finally. "I need to know who Michael Drake is," I said. "He's tied to all of this, and I think he's the key to figuring out what my father was involved in." Kevin sighed. "I'll see what I can dig up. But, James, be careful. These people don't play games." While I waited for Kevin to get back to me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I left my apartment, I scanned the street for unfamiliar cars or people who seemed out of place. I checked my phone for signs of tampering, though I wouldn't have known what to look for even if I found something. My paranoia only grew when I noticed a black SUV parked near my building 2 nights in a row. It was always empty, but its presence felt deliberate, like a silent reminder that I was being monitored. By the third day, I was starting to lose sleep. When Kevin finally called back, his tone was grim. "I found something," he said. "Michael Drake is the CEO of Blackhawk Industries, or at least he was until about 5 years ago. The company hasn't filed any public records since then, and Drake seems to have disappeared from the grid." "Disappeared?" I repeated, frowning. "No LinkedIn, no social media, no public appearances. It's like he just vanished." "Do you think he's dead?" "I don't know," Kevin admitted. "But if he's still alive, he's keeping a very low profile." I let that sink in. If Drake had disappeared, who was running Blackhawk now? And why was Patrick still involved with the company so many years later? That evening, I decided to return to the Red Lantern. I knew it was a risk, but it felt like my only chance to get answers. The men I'd overheard talking about Patrick, about me, were connected to Blackhawk, and I needed to know what they knew. The bar was just as dim and unwelcoming as before, but this time, I wasn't there for a drink. I scanned the room, looking for familiar faces, but none of the men from the hallway were there. I was about to leave when I noticed the bartender watching me. "You're back," he said, his tone neutral. "I need to talk to someone," I said, lowering my voice. "About Michael Drake." The bartender's expression didn't change, but his posture stiffened slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Look," I said, leaning closer. "I don't want trouble. I just need answers. My father, Patrick Sullivan, was involved with Drake and Blackhawk. He left me his safe, and now people are threatening me to stay quiet. I need to know why." The bartender's eyes narrowed. "You should have stayed quiet," he muttered. Before I could respond, he jerked his head toward the back door. "Go home, kid. This isn't your fight." I didn't leave. Instead, I waited outside the bar, keeping an eye on the alley behind the building. I didn't have a plan. I just hoped someone would lead me to more information. My patience paid off an hour later when a man I recognized from my last visit stepped out the back door. He was one of the voices I'd overheard in the hallway. I followed him at a distance, keeping to the shadows as he made his way through the industrial district. He eventually stopped in front of a small warehouse, glancing around before unlocking the door and slipping inside. I waited for a few minutes, then crept closer. The building was dark except for a faint light spilling through a crack in the curtains. Peering through the window, I saw a small office space with a desk, a computer, and several file cabinets. The man was sitting at the desk, typing furiously. I couldn't make out much, but one thing caught my attention. A file sitting on the corner of the desk with the name Patrick Sullivan written across the top. My breath hitched. They had a file on my father. I didn't have time to think. I needed that file. Checking to make sure the street was empty, I slipped around to the back of the warehouse and found a side door that was slightly ajar. The faint hum of the man's typing reached my ears as I crept inside. The office was at the end of a short hallway. I stayed close to the wall, my heart pounding as I approached. When I reached the door, I peeked inside. The man was still focused on the computer, his back to me. I moved quickly, grabbing the file from the desk and slipping back into the hallway before he could notice. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, the file clutched tightly in my hands. Inside were pages of documents, records of Patrick's involvement with Blackhawk, meeting notes, and even surveillance photos of him. But it wasn't just about Patrick. There were photos of me too. Seeing my own face staring back at me from the photos sent a chill down my spine. These weren't candid family snapshots or pictures Patrick might have taken years ago. They were recent, taken outside my apartment at the grocery store, even as I walked to work. Someone had been following me, documenting my every move, and I had no idea for how long. I spread the contents of the file across my living room floor, trying to make sense of it all. Most of the documents were detailed records of Patrick's involvement with Blackhawk, transactions, meeting schedules, even a few grainy photos of him sitting at tables with unfamiliar men. But there were also notes written in Patrick's hand, scrawled in the margins of typewritten pages. Drake, missing since 2018? Nightfall, who's in charge now? My insurance, use only if necessary. The last note stood out to me. My insurance. What did Patrick mean by that? Was it something in the safe? Or was it something I hadn't found yet? Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The black SUV that had been parked near my building was gone, but every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. It was like the air around me had changed, charged with an invisible tension. I started carrying the file with me everywhere, keeping it hidden in my backpack. If someone broke into my apartment, I wasn't going to let them find it. I spent hours combing through the documents, searching for a lead, anything that could explain why Patrick had left this to me. But the more I dug, the more questions I uncovered. What was Project Nightfall? Why had Michael Drake disappeared? And what was Patrick's role in all of this? The breakthrough came when I decided to look closer at Patrick's notebook, the small black journal I'd found in the safe. Most of it was filled with cryptic notes and random dates, but one page stood out. Patrick had drawn a map, a crude, hand-drawn sketch of what looked like a warehouse, with a series of X's marked along one side. I didn't recognize the location at first, but then I noticed a note scrawled in the corner. Pilsen District. It hit me immediately. Pilsen was an old industrial area in Chicago, filled with abandoned factories and warehouses. If Patrick had left me this map, it had to mean something. The next evening, I drove out to Pilsen. The streets were quiet, the buildings looming like shadows against the darkening sky. I parked a few blocks away from where I thought the warehouse might be, pulling the map out of my jacket pocket as I walked. When I finally found it, my pulse quickened. The warehouse looked abandoned, its windows shattered and its exterior covered in graffiti. But there was something about it that felt wrong. The X's on Patrick's map corresponded to what looked like old loading docks along the side of the building. I checked each one until I found what I was looking for, a rusted metal door with a small padlock. I hesitated, Patrick's warning echoing in my mind. Be careful who you trust. This wasn't about trust anymore. It was about answers. The The lock wasn't difficult to break. I brought a set of bolt cutters just in case. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty space beyond. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom, and stepped inside. The room was empty except for a large, metal filing cabinet in the corner. Its surface was scratched and dented, and a thick layer of dust covered the top. I approached it cautiously, pulling open the drawers one by one. Most of them were empty, but the bottom drawer held a single folder. Inside were more documents, printouts, handwritten notes, even a few photos. But what caught my attention was a small, unmarked USB drive taped to the back of one of the pages. My heart pounded as I pocketed the drive. Whatever was on it, I knew it had to be important. Back at home, I plugged the USB drive into my laptop. A single file popped up, labeled Nightfall_archive. I opened it, and my screen filled with documents, memos, contracts, even email correspondence. It didn't take long to realize what I was looking at. Project Nightfall wasn't just a code name. It was an operation. According to the files, Blackhawk Industries had been using its offshore accounts to fund illegal activities, arms deals, money laundering, and even political bribery. The operation was massive, spanning multiple countries and involving dozens of high-ranking individuals. But the most shocking part was a list of names. At the top of the list was Michael Drake, and near the bottom, in Patrick's handwriting, was a single note: insurance. If something happens to me, send to DOJ. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. Patrick hadn't just been a pawn in this operation. He'd been gathering evidence, compiling everything he could to expose Blackhawk and its key players. But why? Had he planned to turn them in? Or had he been using this information as leverage to protect himself? I didn't have time to dwell on it, because a sudden noise outside my window snapped me out of my thoughts. I froze, listening intently. The sound came again, a faint rustling, like footsteps on gravel. I crept to the window and peered outside, my heart pounding. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I caught a glimpse of movement near the edge of the parking lot. Two men in dark clothing were standing by a black SUV, their heads tilted as if they were scanning the building. My stomach dropped. They'd found me. I quickly gathered the documents and the USB drive, stuffing them into my backpack. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and called Kevin. "They're here," I whispered. "I don't know how, but they found me." Kevin's voice was sharp. "Get out of there. Don't try to confront them. Just go." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "What about the evidence? The USB drive?" "Keep it with you," he said. "It's your only leverage. And James, be careful." I slipped out the back door of my apartment building, sticking to the shadows as I made my way to my car. The men didn't seem to notice me, their attention still focused on the front entrance. As I drove away, a single thought consumed me. Whatever Patrick had been involved in, it was bigger than I'd imagined. And now it wasn't just his fight. It was mine. I didn't stop driving for hours. The men outside my apartment were a clear message. I wasn't just digging into Patrick's secrets anymore. I was stepping on dangerous ground. My mind raced as I replayed everything I'd uncovered. The documents, the USB drive, the cryptic warnings Patrick had left behind. It all pointed to one undeniable truth. Blackhawk Industries wasn't just some criminal operation. It was a web, and I was caught in it. I finally stopped at a motel miles outside of Chicago. The place was run down and barely occupied, perfect for keeping a low profile. I checked into a room under a fake name, locking the door behind me and pushing a chair under the handle for good measure. Sitting at the small desk, I opened my laptop and plugged in the USB drive again. The files I'd seen earlier now felt heavier, more ominous. Patrick's note about sending the archive to the DOJ repeated in my mind. He'd trusted me to finish what he couldn't. But the deeper I looked into the files, the more questions I had. The evidence was damning. Proof of bribes, illegal deals, and even contracts for assassinations. One name kept appearing alongside Michael Drake's, Victor Crane. I didn't recognize the name, but from what I could piece together, he'd taken over Blackhawk after Drake disappeared. Patrick's notes painted a chilling picture of Crane, ruthless, ambitious, and willing to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to the operation, including Patrick. That was when it hit me. Patrick hadn't just left me the safe to uncover the truth. He'd left it to protect me. He must have known his involvement with Blackhawk had painted a target on his back. The insurance he mentioned wasn't just about exposing the operation. It was about giving me a way out. But there was no way out now. Not unless I finished what he'd started. I spent the next few days carefully planning my next move. I couldn't go to the authorities without proof that I wasn't involved in Blackhawk's activities. The USB drive was my only leverage, and I had to use it strategically. Kevin agreed to help. He set up a meeting with a contact of his, a federal prosecutor who specialized in organized crime. "This is risky," Kevin warned me as we sat in his office, going over the plan. "If Crane finds out you're talking to the feds, he won't hesitate to silence you." "He already knows," I said grimly. "That's why we have to move fast." The meeting was scheduled for the following evening at a secure federal building downtown. I arrived early, clutching my backpack tightly as I walked through the metal detectors. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Erica Monroe, greeted me with a firm handshake. "I've been briefed on the situation," she said, leading me to a conference room. "If what you have is as solid as Kevin says, we'll take it from here." I handed her the USB drive, watching as she plugged it into her laptop. Her expression shifted as she scrolled through the files, her eyes narrowing. "This is significant," she said finally, looking up at me. "But it's also dangerous. If the people behind this find out you've shared this with us." "I know," I interrupted, "but I can't let them get away with it. They killed my father. They threatened me. This has to end." What happened next was a whirlwind. The DOJ launched an immediate investigation, using the evidence on the USB drive to obtain warrants and freeze Blackhawk's accounts. Crane's network began to unravel, piece by piece. But it wasn't without consequences. 2 nights after the meeting, I woke to the sound of shattering glass. My heart leapt into my throat as I grabbed my phone and scrambled out of bed. Someone was in the motel room. I ducked into the bathroom, locking the door as heavy footsteps echoed outside. My hands trembled as I dialed Kevin's number. "They're here," I whispered. "Stay calm," he said, his voice steady. "I'll call the police. Just stay hidden." The next few minutes felt like an eternity. I could hear the intruders moving through the room, rifling through my belongings. They must have been looking for the USB drive, but they didn't know I'd already handed it over. When the police arrived, the men were gone. But the message was clear. Crane wasn't going to let this go. The following weeks were a blur of hearings, depositions, and sleepless nights. The DOJ dismantled Blackhawk piece by piece, arresting key players and exposing decades of corruption. Victor Crane, however, remained elusive. Rumors circulated that he'd fled the country, taking whatever wealth he could with him. The feds were confident they'd catch him eventually, but until then, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. As for me, life would never be the same. Patrick's legacy was complicated, messy, even, but in the end he'd tried to do the right thing. He'd sacrificed everything to protect me, and I owed it to him to make sure his story was told. One afternoon, I visited his grave for the first time since the funeral. I stood there for a long time, the wind rustling the leaves around me. "I get it now," I said quietly. "I understand why you left, why you did what you did, and I'm sorry it had to end this way." For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. The nightmare wasn't over. Crane was still out there, and I'd probably spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. But I wasn't running anymore. Patrick had trusted me to finish what he'd started, and I had. And that was enough. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. Got thoughts or experiences you'd like to share? Drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.